Okay, so we're in the second chapter.
Mm-hmm.
So now in this second chapter, what we're going to do is we're going to explain that the tzitzis are an example of a makif becoming a pnimi, or bringing down a makif without going through the integration process. It's going to skip. It's an example of a dilug. So the idea here is that the tzitzis, the 32 strings of the tzitzis, they're like hairs. And hair in general represents a dilug, a skipping over.
The hair's dead. Hair doesn't have any life.
That's the idea, that it comes out of a makif. That it doesn't, a makif you can't feel. That's the whole idea of a surrounding light. That you're not conscious of it. It's there, but you're not, meaning you have no sense of it. But it's there. Okay? So all hair represents that state in which something is around you, it's alive, but you have no sense of it. There's no awareness of it. Because like you say, you can't sense it, you can't feel it. There's a presence that you can't become aware of, because you can't sense it. You can't become, it doesn't integrate into your mind, you can't become conscious of it, but it's here. What are the examples of this? So he says two things, 32 pathways of wisdom, and the 32 strings of the tzitzis. Okay? They represent this. And that's called Hodo al Eretz v'Shamayim. Hodo means his splendor. But really what it means is like a surrounding light. It's like you're saying that somebody has an aura around them. So you can't feel it, but it's there. Okay?
This was the raising out emotion of it?
For example. So what do we get from this? So we'll skip to the next. So the Torah does this. The Torah is like a presence of Hashem in the world. Even when you read Torah, it's not exactly that you can feel godliness. It's not, when you integrate the Torah, yes, but when you read Torah, I'm saying you just read the Chumash, it's not suddenly the world becomes now godly. It doesn't work that way. V'ainyanu, שעיקר גילוי אלוקות בכלים יהיה על ידי עליות העולמות 50,000 יובלות. He says the regular way in which the world is going to become aware of godliness is a long evolutionary process for which the sages have a term that they call 50,000 jubilees. What they're trying to say is it's going to take a long, long time. Eventually the world refines so much that it begins to understand what godliness is. Right? One example of that is that why did we suddenly understand electricity? Okay? Electricity was known since the beginning of time. Static electricity was everywhere. Everybody knows about it. Why couldn't we master how to use this force, even though we knew it was here? So the idea is that it's a slow process. It's a slow refinement. Science moves very slowly. And eventually it catches up. And it realizes there's this force in nature. Now we have this thing called gravitation, which we've known about forever also, but we didn't know what to call it. So in the 17th century, Isaac Newton came and called it gravitation. He says, I don't know how it works, but here it is. This is what it does. Who knows? It could be that gravitation, even though it's a very weak force, could be 1 billion times more useful than electricity. We just don't know, because we don't know what to do with it. All we know is the way gravitation happens naturally in the world. Same with static electricity is pretty much how electricity happens naturally. But nobody knows how to create a dynamo yet, a gravitation well. Like, you don't know how to do that yet. If you could create a gravitation well, you could maybe create the opposite of an anti-gravitation well. Who knows? We haven't refined our thought enough to begin to understand how to harness these powers. But they exist. There's a ton of stuff in reality. The same thing is true about godliness. People are beginning to understand that faith is a power that changes reality. So you get some idiots like with in America that have this thing called The Secret, and they tell you you just have to believe that the universe owes you something and it'll give it to you, and this and that, all kinds of crazy mishigas. That's like because that's what I do all day. I read everything that people believe in. Okay? So you see that there's a lot of, but it's begun to be that people understand you have to think positively. That's they're beginning to understand that. They're beginning, which means that they're beginning to understand what faith is. Okay? What is that? What is the power of positive thinking? It's not positive thinking at all. That's not what it is. What it is faith. And what it is that you're connecting to Hashem. You can't say this to somebody, positive thinking equals God, because you can't even explain to them that God is only what's good. So it's where it is. But they say eventually, after enough refinement, everybody will understand that everything is godly. They'll understand that you can't water a plant without faith in Hashem. And unfortunately, you hear this from... I don't want to repeat things that I've heard. Anyway. So that's the normal order of things. And it's a slow refinement process. Very, very slow. And the sages call it 50,000 jubilees. But... until you uncover the infinite. But by receiving the Torah, what did the Jewish people do? They brought the end right now. You have to understand that the Torah is a gigantic leap, which doesn't make any sense to anybody. And what are we saying? We're saying in the end, everybody's going to run to put tefillin on. Why? Because they'll understand that this is what makes the world go round. Okay? And say, imagine that 500 years ago, somebody would say, "Look, you see that mountain over there? Buy it." The guy looks at it and says, "Why would I want to buy it?" He says, "No, buy it." He says, "There's nothing there. There's no gold. There's no diamonds. There's no this. There's no that." Turns out there's molybdenum in it. But who knew? Who cared? Nobody knew. Nobody understood. Now you understand why those rare earths are very valuable. Or uranium. And who would have thought it's a good idea to buy up deserts? Because that's where the uranium is. You even get sick. It's not a good place. You go there, you come back sick, you're this, you're that. Maybe people don't usually get very sick from naturally occurring uranium. But you feel not so good after it. There is some radiation sickness from it. Why would I buy that place? But he can't see it because he doesn't understand what you can do with it. The same thing, everything that the Torah is saying is too futuristic. You can't get it. And that's what happened at the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. We made a giant leap forward. And since then, we've been trying to catch up. Our minds have been trying to catch up with our faith, put it that way. We're trying to understand what is this thing that we did. So what we did was we revealed the end of 50,000 Jubilees right now, in the present. So what is that called? And that is called that the Torah, so let's just read it. They revealed the infinite now. עד שהגיעו לגילוי הזה, ועל ידי התורה נתגלה בחינת גילוי זה בעולם הזה. By the Torah, the end was revealed now. And how do the sages say this? It said in the Zohar, כי אורייתא מחוכמה נפקת. Because the Torah came out of wisdom. What's the idea of wisdom? Just what we said before, the 32 pathways of wisdom, which are a leap from the surrounding light into our reality. And they bring it down suddenly. As it says in the Tanya and in many other places, that the only way that the infinite can reveal itself here in this world is through the light of wisdom. What does that mean? What's the light of wisdom? First of all, it's the Torah, but in psychological terms, it means self-nullification. The moment you have self-nullification, the Chokhmah in every world is the place through which the Or Ein Sof appears. That's in the first chapter of Tanya, second chapter. So what happened was a giant leap. That's why Atzilus is called wisdom in general. The general wisdom in worlds, right? The wisdom is Atzilus, understanding Bina is creation, Bria, and so on. Why? Because in Atzilus, you see the Ein Sof, you see the infinite. שמתלבש על ידי המלכות דאק באצילות, ועל כן באצילות הוא גילוי אור אינסוף ברוך הוא שמאיר בבחינת חוכמה. מה שאין כן בבריאה אינו מאיר בבחינת חוכמה, אלא על ידי התלבשות גמור בבינה, וזהו עניין המסך, ויצירה אין מאיר, and so on. Not important for what we want. והנה בשעת מתן תורה, היה למטה בעולם הזה גילוי חוכמה עילה, המאיר באצילות. What happened at the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai? That the light of the infinite that is in the world of Atzilus suddenly was revealed here in this world. That's called the Gilui of Chokhmah Ilah, the Gilui of the supernal wisdom in our world. Asher hu chakim velo chokhmah idea, shebchokhmah lubash meir mamash or ensof baruch hu, haya gilui ze mamash b'Har Sinai. That's what they got at Mount Sinai. They got an experience of the infinite. What Moshe Rabbeinu has all the time, everybody had for whatever amount of time. V'zeu kol dodi medaleg. That's why it says, kol dodi nezeba medaleg al ha'arim mekapetz al hagvot. So what is that pasuk? That pasuk is talking about. No, it's in Shir Hashirim. So that pasuk is talking about Matan Torah. That's what the sages say. Can. Oh, that's also can. But same idea. So David and Shlomo, they both wrote about the same thing, the mountains jumping. So we learned about that. So because when Hashem is revealed, there's disorder because the infinite causes everything to be equal, right? That what was a valley suddenly becomes a mountain, and vice versa, and so on. So that's called mountains jumping. But here what he's talking about is that Hashem skipped. Here's not talking about the mountain. Hinei kol dodi zeba medaleg. The voice of my beloved is skipping. He's skipping over mountains. He's skipping over valleys. Meaning that Hashem, when He came to take us out of Egypt, when He gave the Torah at Mount Sinai, He skipped. What do you mean skipped? He completely ignored the normal evolution of the world and said, I'm giving the Torah now. I'm revealing myself now. Really, if we would have followed the normal evolution of the world, of mankind, when would we have been given the Torah? In 50,000 Jubilees. A long, long time from now. Right? That's the general thing of in life also. We talked about this. The Baal Shem Tov said, if you really wanted to raise a child, so you have to explain to him in the beginning of his life that Hashem is the milk that he's milking from his mother. And then you need to explain to him that Hashem is the sandbox, and Hashem is this, and they keep going. Until on his deathbed you whisper in his ear and you say, you know what? Hashem is much more than everything you've seen. So he says, why don't we teach people that way? Because that way they would understand Hashem, the immanence of Hashem. So we don't teach them this because we don't want them to be idolaters, meaning to understand Hashem as something physical. We don't want them to have that mistaken understanding. So we don't do it gradually. We don't do an evolution. Rather, we take the end, which is to understand that Hashem is much more than everything you'll ever see, and we say it right from the start. And that's also skipping. It's the same type of idea. You follow? But when you think about it, that's the problem with Jewish faith. That's why people can't get it. Because what do you? It's much more normal to be an idolater. Okay? It's much more normal. Why? Because what are you saying? God is the sun. God is the moon. That I understand. Because that you can relate to. You can understand what we're talking about. When you come and you say Hashem is nothing you can relate to, so what are we talking about? Who are you talking to? Today the world is Baruch Hashem is abstract enough that people can begin to understand laws of physics. Some people understand this actually. Okay? I think out of the total population of the world, about 0.01%, I would say 1 in 10,000 people today understand what a physical law is and why there are no formulas that have to be floating around. And there's about, I think, 1 in 10,000 people get that. anybody who's done any kind of abstract thinking in mathematics and physics and in chemistry even understands that. But imagine the rest of the people, the other 9,999 people. You're going to tell them Hashem is some abstract thing that you can't connect to? What are you talking about? You can't fathom. Not that you can't connect to. You can't fathom. You can't understand. What are you talking about?
You don't think people accept that?
No. They thank God, they believe without understanding what they believe. But they can't see Hashem as something abstract. They still hold by the Rambam. The Rambam is Chokhmah v'lo b'chokhmah idiyah. He's wise, but not the wisdom we know. So what kind of wisdom? So what are we talking about? Rambam is negating everything you know. He's saying he's nothing you know. Okay, so what is he? But we can say something better than that today. We can do much better than that. Because we have abstract thought already. We can understand that the fact that every circle has circumference of 2 pi r. Okay? Then there's no pi anywhere. There's no number 2 anywhere. And there's no radius that you need to measure. It's an abstract explanation of how this works. You could say that that's what gives life to the circumference even. So, eventually the analogy is going to break down. But you get the idea that we've refined enough that some people can now understand what Avram Avinu meant 3,800 years ago. What he meant when he said that Hashem is one and he's not physical. You begin to understand. How did he know? He made a giant leap. I don't know how we know.
Where did Avraham Avinu say that?
What do you mean? Where did he say that?
So did Avraham Avinu say?
Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Obviously, Yaakov knew it from somewhere. That was his tradition. That God is one. He's none of the things that you've ever seen. So how do you talk to him? How do you give him sacrifices? How do you this? How do you that? Good question. That's why the Rambam says the whole thing of sacrifices and whatever is a leftover from the time that's what people understood. But eventually we'll get over it. That's what he says in the Moreh Nevuchim. It could be that he's wrong, and there's other reasons for it, completely different. We're not. If we ever bring sacrifices again, we won't do it because that's how people served the sun and the moon 4,000 years ago. We don't connect to that anymore. We don't care. It doesn't say anything for us. It doesn't do anything for us. If we do sacrifice, it'll be from a completely different reason. But what I'm saying is that what he's trying to get across is that the normal way that the world should have come to Judaism, to Torah, is a long, long refinement process. And by Hashem giving the Torah, he suddenly skipped over 50,000 jubilees of history. He basically took us from a bunch of primitive cannibals, or whatever they were, and he suddenly catapulted them 50,000 jubilees into the future. That's what the revelation of Torah Mount Sinai is. As far as, again, as human thought and human ability to grasp something goes. That's what he did. So it was a tremendous dilug. To do this, he had to give us wisdom. These are the 32 pathways of wisdom. So now, I'm skipping 2 paragraphs. V'zeu inyan lamed bet chutei hatzitzit. In the same way that was done, okay, that was done in the general sense of what Judaism is, of what Torah is, there's a more particular skip that happens every day, all the time. It's not like the giving of the Torah Mount Sinai. That happened only once. But here we have the same mechanism doing something else for us. And this mechanism is dependent on these 32 strings of the tzitzis. They also create this leap. And they're like a short circuit. They're like jumping you from one place to the next without ever touching it. It's like a leap in time. Except here we're not going to be talking about time. We're not going to be talking about the tzitzis doesn't take you forward in time. It takes you forward in terms of development. In terms of your development. Okay? And let's see this. וזהו עניין למד בית חוטי הציצית, כי הנה ציצית ומשון ויקחני בציצית ראשי. It says the tzitzis are like hairs. That's what they mean. Because what do we see? We see, in fact, there's a whole thing that, where's the shaitel discussed in Torah? The shaitel in Torah is tzitzis. Because tzitzit roshi means the hairs of my head. Okay? So the hairs of my head, that's the shaitel. שהוא המשכת בחינת שערות להעיר לכנסת ישראל. Because what the tzitzis does is it brings a leap from the surrounding light, causes it to leap into where you are now. And that's called, it's the same process as what elsewhere in Kabbalah, and we'll see in the book of Daniel, is symbolized by hairs. That's what hairs also do. They do the same thing. They leap from the surrounding into a place that if they would have had to descend slowly until the place they're leaping into could appreciate them, it would have taken an infinite amount of time. What's the example I'm thinking of here? The example is very simple. I'll say it in the beginning because otherwise the rest of it is hard to follow. When you're older, you become more, let's just say, calm. You don't get so you don't get
mellowy.
You mellow out. Yeah. So you don't get angry so quickly. You don't fall apart. Like I told you now, I think we're in front of another Oslo, just a lot worse. But again, it's nothing to do with Eretz Yisrael. Nobody's going to divide Eretz Yisrael anymore because they're tired of that nonsense. The Arabs don't want it, and nobody else wants it. That's not going to be the issue. They might talk about it, but it's not. There's no danger there. The danger is in assimilation now. They want to create one people now. Everybody is mixed up. And Arabs and Jews, everything's the same. Everybody's equal, and you shouldn't have same-sex marriages. You shouldn't tell anybody what sex they are. You shouldn't tell them what gender they are. You shouldn't nothing. Progressivism at its best, and that's the great Mashiach now that will unify the world.
How long is that going to last?
I don't know, but it's going to make a lot of people are going to die because of it. Not hopefully physical death, but a lot of people will die a spiritual death because of this. So I told you that when Oslo started in 1990, 91, and actually it was 92, I think, 91. So I was deathly sick for the first week after they so now I see that I don't get so, I'm not sick. Why am I not sick? So one answer could be, I don't care anymore. But I don't think that's true. I care very deeply. I think we need to do a lot of things.
No, the answer is because you survived those, so now you're optimistic that you'll survive this.
No, it's because I mellowed out. I've realized that the world doesn't sit on my shoulders. And there's only so much I can contribute. My ego has been cut down to size. Those are all very important contributions, but the main contribution is that I'm not so full of harsh judgment. I don't think that it's a conspiracy. What I see it for is the same mistakes that people make all the time. Okay, they make mistakes like I make mistakes. So what do you do to prevent a mistake? You can't prevent it really, but you have to find a way to minimize the repercussions. So over time you begin to see the world, it's not the end of the world. You need to fix it. You need to find a way to do something. You can't sit at home and do nothing. But don't feel that you've just been stabbed in the heart. Because you haven't been stabbed in the heart. That's not the situation. It's not the end of the world. The world will continue. I don't want anybody to be hurt, so I'm going to try to do whatever I can to prevent that. But you mellow out in the same way that in the beginning, if your first child does something, it's the end of the world. Then when you get to you're raising your last child.
17 or 18.
Good, okay, we've seen this, not so impressed anymore. We know that it passes, it goes away, it'll be okay. It's true there are events that are catastrophic. It's also true. That happens once in a while. But in general, what people do is never that catastrophic. Usually it's not. So you mellow out over time. That's called the Hasidim that fix the harsh judgments. So the Hasidim, they come from the surrounding light in this case. Because what they're saying is, look, take things with a grain of salt, some proportions won't hurt. Don't think that's... Chesed says, don't be so harsh. You can fix this without being so harsh. You can make it better without that. And that you learn over time. So the idea here is that the tzitzis give you that. The tzitzis give you perspective. The tzitzis is like the surrounding light coming down and saying to you, this is not your world. It belongs to God. Don't get so upset. You need to do what you need to do, but you shouldn't stress over it. Okay? Okay. So that was the thing that Korach, as we'll see, he was against putting the tzitzis on. That's what he said. A tallis that's all tchelis doesn't need tzitzis.
Because?
That's what we'll see tomorrow. Okay, but that was his issue. His issue was, we don't need to hear about the chesed that comes from the high priest. We don't need that anymore. We can live the way we are. And we can live harshly as harshly as we want. We don't need perspective.